Thank you, Dr. Kim. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Elbridge Colby. Bridge is co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. His varied experience across the Defense Department, the State Department, and the intelligence community seems to inform this long-term project. Most recently, between 2017 and 2018, Bridge served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Strategy and Force Development. In that role, he led the development and circulation of the Defense Department's National Defense Strategy. In 2021, Bridge published a book, The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, which in many ways seems to expand on the themes of the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and which provides a frank appraisal of his views beyond what could be provided in a public government document. I'm sure we'll cover some elements of the book in our discussion today. The book is thoughtful, clear, and has pointed edges. It seems written by someone with the theoretical training of a scholar, the honed logic of a lawyer, and the scope and vision of a grand strategist. Please join me in welcoming Bridge to provide his opening remarks.
Thank you, Dan.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to be with you all. As we discussed, I think a question and answer would be the most useful and suitable. I mean, I think the U.S. ROK relationship is of fundamental importance today in a way that actually is greater than probably ever before. But we're also going to have to rethink a lot of the traditional approach, which has been primarily focused on the peninsula. And that, of course, will continue to be the case. But I think the U.S. ROK relationship, as with all other relationships in the world, is going to have to be looked at anew in the context of the confrontation with China. And that doesn't mean that the U.S. ROK alliance needs to be primarily oriented on China. It just means everything has to kind of be evaluated in that in terms of the overriding importance of that dynamic for the United States. So I think that has a couple of particular sort of implications as I see it. One is that obviously the North Korea problem is not going to go away, and in fact seems to be getting worse, if anything. And the major problem there is, of course, not only the persistence of the direct threat to South Korea at both the conventional and WMD level, but the growing threat to the U.S. homeland posed by North Korean nuclear-tipped ICBMs or other long-range delivery mechanisms. And I believe that poses a fundamental problem for U.S. extended deterrence over the ROK with respect to North Korea, because as I explained it in the Voice of America recently, the peninsula alone is not sufficiently important to Americans, to be very frank, to justify the loss of American cities. So DPRK threat to escalate, if it involves the capability to directly threaten the U.S. homeland, is a very, very severe challenge to U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. This is the threat to the homeland is paradoxically a bit less severe from China and even Russia, because the stakes of a confrontation between the United States and China, or even the United States and Russia, or the United States and the Soviet Union in the old days, were sufficiently grave to at least plausibly justify risking U.S. cities. But nothing that North Korea can do on its own is sufficiently significant for Americans. So I think the Washington Declaration, candidly, and I don't mean to be churlish or negative, but I think it's largely papering over the problem and will be seen as a blip in time. And basically my view is that South Korean concerns are warranted. And I think the United States owes South Korea a more serious, kind of genuine intellectual and strategic response, rather than just more protestations of reassurance. When, as far as I can tell, U.S. policy on North Korea is not really trying to do anything. I mean, it's hard to fault them, because I don't know what you can do that's not really drastic. But we may be in the territory of thinking about really drastic things. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think we're back into the world in which we have to assume that North Korea would act either directly at Beijing's direction or opportunistically in the event that the United States is caught up or is engaged in a conflict with China. If you're China and you think there's a war brewing potentially with the United States, which they appear to believe and they're preparing for, you don't, why would you leave any potential asset unused? They're preparing to strike US bases, Japanese bases, possibly South Korean facilities, but certainly Taiwan, Philippines, possibly the US homeland itself, or certainly Hawaii, maybe, Guam. They're building a large nuclear force. They are deepening relations with the Russians, presumably to continue to try to distract us in Europe. They're building relations with Iran, presumably to try to distract us in the Middle East. So it stands to reason that they would look to North Korea, lips and teeth, right? I mean, obviously they have difficulties, but there's a mutuality of interest where I assume North Korea could see that that it could make gains while the United States is otherwise engaged in a war that, God forbid, if it happens, but we're not sure how we're going to fare. So that means we have to be prepared for simultaneous or near simultaneous conflict. The U.S. military does not have the resources, and we've seen how we're stressed even supporting Ukraine in a proxy war. In fact, we have to get the South Koreans to help support the Ukrainians, apparently. So we're very stressed just with a proxy war against a Russia that has proved much less formidable than we feared, thankfully. But that's not, I don't think we can assume that about China. So if that's the case, if there's a war with China, or frankly, even if there isn't a war with China, but there could be, and North Korea acts, we will have to, in my view, we will have to withhold forces that would be very relevant to the defense of South Korea. So what does that mean? And I've written about this in my book and in some other outlets in the Korean press. Korea is going to have to be largely responsible for its own conventional defense, and even long-range capabilities and strategic capabilities are going to be at a premium. I mean, we're not going to be throwing B-2s around if we think they might be, or B-21s if they might be shot down or used up in a Korea conflict if they might be used in a China conflict, right? Because China's more important. So we have to win the China war. That's my view. And again, I say this from a position of sympathy and support for the U.S.-ROC alliance, which I believe is vital. But I think it's better for us to be candid and realistic rather than the Washington Declaration kind of struck me as wishful thinking, frankly, in this sort of protestations against reality. But I mean, I'm being a bit negative, but like not really grappling with the problem, at least from what I can see from the outside. So that's, and I think over time, look, if the PLA can mount a sustained air and sea assault against Taiwan, which is 100 miles from Fujian, or I can't remember if that's the right province, but it can also mount an air and sea assault against Korea, which is 100 miles from the Shandong Peninsula, give or take, maybe a little more, 150, 200, but within striking distance. So there's going to be a direct PLA military threat to South Korea. And people say, oh, that would never happen. They'd never do that. Well, capability is the father of intent. And China, South Korea is a great prize in this competition because of its economic strength and its geographic position and its longstanding relationship with the United States. That's also going to be, so I think the ROC is going to have to be prepared for North Korea and China, and the U.S. ROC alliance are going to be after for the U.S. forces in particular for the defense of South Korea against the PRC, which I think will be increasingly plausible. This is, I think this has to cause both of us to kind of reassess. And I when I was in South Korea last time in 2019, I was thinking about this. I mean, I think I came away, reconfirmed in my conviction that the U.S. ROC alliance is vital. From our perspective, you're one of the 10 largest economies in the world, growing, really dynamic society, very powerful military, very powerful technologically, incredibly important geography, obviously, immediately connected to Japan and, very proximate to China. And then, of course, our longstanding alliance and history and your status as a democracy also adds on to that. But so I think for us, we have to draw a perimeter somewhere. Keeping South Korea inside of it is very important. I think for the ROC, it also makes a lot of sense. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. But I think I detect that in the ROC, there is a tendency sometimes to say, well, can we duck below this rivalry? Can we try to play both sides? And I think just practically speaking, and it's kind of human nature, it's intuitive, but you're too important and you're too central to be ignored, right? So, Belgium was a country that hoped to duck undercover because it wouldn't offend anybody, but it was too important because it was the natural, invasion route for the Germans in particular. And so, and for many centuries before that. And so I think South Korea is similarly, it's going to be along the battle line, if you will, the geopolitical battle line and possibly the actual battle line. So in that context, you can't expect to sit it out. If you're New Zealand, you can sit it out maybe, if you're South Africa. But if you're Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Japan, you're too important. In that context, I think it makes sense to pick a side and stay close, because then you're part of a defended perimeter. You're not a no man's land, and that's the worst place for a country in the middle to be. And I think that's where South Korea, certainly under this government, which I applaud, is moving. Or has moved, I think, pretty clearly. It's never left that. But I think that's very wise, and I think hopefully that dynamic will continue. But I think that's sort of my perspective. I guess the biggest point I would say is that we need to focus on the North Korea threat, but always, it's my general impression, having participated in some Korea Peninsula discussions over the years. Maybe it's different now, but there is still a tendency to see it primarily in the context of the peninsula, and I don't think that we can do that anymore. It's not going to be how a decision should be made, at least in my view. So maybe with that, we can open it up to discussion.
Okay, Sean Creamer. Sean Creamer.
Yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm up. I just was getting my mic. Yes, sir. Thanks. I've been reading some of your work on the strategy of denial and cost imposition. I'm concerned that we're unlikely to induce Beijing or North Korea to accept defeat or to restrain escalation. You've also written on how the U.S. and its allies might better prepare to deal with a China and even a North Korea that continues to double down and tries to escalate to victory. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the correlation of forces in the Indo-Pacific and whether current efforts by the U.S. and its allies remain sufficient to deter. Thank you.
Well, great, thank you, and thanks for the very kind and thoughtful introduction from Daniel. I'm glad I'm not the only one with technical problems, so I don't feel so bad. Even Bruce Bennett has been defeated by technical challenges. Thank you, Sean. Well, to your question, I'm not comfortable, and that provides a lot of the. I think that for those who follow my writings or on Twitter or what have you, I'm increasingly sharp, because I'm very concerned, because I'm not. There are many people who know the military balance than I do, but when I look at it, we can get into all the theory, but I think the Russian war is actually showing us even a poorly performing military, eventually it tends to turn into an issue of numbers and position and willpower. And there are occasional exceptions, the Mexican-American War, 6-Day War, but normally involving major great powers, it's going to turn into a big, slugfest. And I think the Chinese are just a lot better prepared for the slugfest than we are. And it's been disturbing to watch us fall back through the various wickets of our confidence. 20 years ago, the Chinese would barely have gotten out of Chinese airspace before they all been shot down and sunk. The ships probably wouldn't even have left port. Now we're basically like betting that our forces are multiples better. I mean, that's like the baseline assumption, is that our forces are multiples better than the Chinese. And I don't know. I don't know that, but it worries me a lot that that's our bet. And I don't know what the assumptions are in these various analyses, but it worries me that they're over optimistic. And when you look at, the ability to produce steel, national willpower, position, and you look at the resolve of Xi Jinping, it's very disturbing. And one of the things that really disturbs me is that Washington appears to think things are, manageable. And so part of my alarm is because I don't think cost imposition strategies are going to work. I mean, who are we kidding? We're going to cost impose on Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping? No, they're going to cost impose on us. I mean, it's delusional. I think Beijing is worried about overthrowing the apple cart of the global economy and the unpredictability. But if they could get that into a box, I mean, almost every indicator that we see coming out suggests that China's getting ready for a war. I mean, just the other day, the Wall Street Journal reports they're shutting down commercial access to companies in China and general information, growing exit bans. Obviously, the nuclear forces, the military buildup, Xi Jinping's rhetoric, et cetera, but it's these little things. And so that worries me a lot. Now, I think North Korea would probably stay in a box if it were just about North Korea. If we were back in 1994, okay, we'll keep building our missile defenses, but we can't afford to keep pouring money into GBIs, as far as I can tell. Others are more expert on GBI than I am, and I do believe it's making progress. It's very expensive. Nuclear technology, long-range missile technology, penetration aids are mature technology, and the especially in this nuclear exchange, the exchange favors the attacker. So, what in a sense, what worries me more than anything is that others aren't as worried as I am, because I have yet to have somebody say, "Oh, you're totally missing this huge part of the picture." People might say, "Well, you should give this or that more credit," but it's not like order of magnitude changes, and that's very, very dangerous. And of course, if Taiwan, I think at this point, if they start a war, rationally, they assume that the Americans are going to come in. So then if you're going to start the war, you start it basically preemptively. You come up with some excuse, but you start with a preemptive strike. If you're going to preemptively attack the Americans in the region, you're going to attack the Japanese in the Philippines. So you're going to also attack them. Probably going to attack U.S. in depth, selectively, out in Hawaii, maybe even on the West Coast and so forth, cyber attacks. And then if they are successful in that conflict, it's not followed really by 1942. I mean, they're the world's largest industrial base, and a lot of countries in the region are going to, whether they want to or not, are going to be forced to cut a deal with Beijing. And I think we'll be able to respond to that, but it's going to be pretty awful and that's if we're lucky.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sean, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, sir. Kind of following it. I just don't. I think Ukraine. We've seen the needle move a little bit, but I'm not really sure. I just don't get the feeling that we're taking the threat from China seriously.
I agree,
because we hesitate to say things even like we're even in a Cold War, and we're continuing to use these benign terms like competition when it's really strategic rivalry. Mm-hmm. And I know there's I see there's some preparations, but I don't see that the sense of urgency.
Right.
And and like you said, I do have the concerns about the preemptive, but I'm also a little bit more concerned of a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, where they established the the quarantine zone, and then we're on the other side, and we have to make the decision whether we're going to come in. But again, so I think we tend to treat this as almost like it's a decade. That the threat of conflict is more of a decade away.
Yeah,
I think you've kind of already answered my question, but that was kind of the thought. Is again, I guess, what do you think? And what would be if we are going to make a big move? I look back to the World War II preparations. The Two Ocean Navy Act. We mobilized the Guard. almost a year prior to Pearl Harbor. We started building our merchant marine fleet, or rebuilding our merchant marine fleet, and so we're kind of in that same position of what, I guess if you were king for a day, what would you what kind of strategic investment would you do to better posture the U.S. for deterring and then and perhaps conflict? Thank you.
The single biggest thing I would do probably is just national mobilization of the defense industrial base, not so much conscription, but like really, because it's all about production. In World War II, we had the world's largest industrial base. Now China does by far. And we also, the Soviet Union and the British Empire and the Republic of China were all fighting the Axis. Today, vis-a-vis China, it's not as formidable, I guess, as Nazi Germany, but there's nobody else in Asia except maybe the Indians who really stand up to them on their own. So in a lot of ways, the situation is worse. We were a larger economy alone than all three Axis powers, and China's a bigger economy measured by PPP than we are. And I think the market exchange rate inflates the American economy because of the role of the dollar, and it's very service oriented. In the event of a conflict, are we going to get intellectual property fees from China or Chinese, dominated areas? Probably not. They're going to be able to make stuff. So, yeah. And the timeline issue is, allegedly we're going to have a great Navy in 2040, but I think the Chinese are looking at 2027. We don't know if 2027 is just a date, but gives an orienting point.
Well, thank you. Tong Kim, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for doing this for us. My question for you is, which case will be more likely to happen first? Chinese starting World War, North Korea attacking the South. And what would Japan do in these cases? And you mentioned very little about the role of Japan in terms of alliances and coalitions against Chinese influence and Soviet or Russian influences and the North Korean missile capability and threat. And you also said Washington Declaration was just a sort of a paper wrap of what the problem is. It doesn't really solve any problem. I don't feel any more comfortable than before without the Washington Declaration myself. It doesn't really say anything other than they made sort of nebulous statements in document. That's all they did. And actually what they're going to do, they don't even say whether they're going to actually use nuclear weapons in case North Korea uses a nuclear weapon against the South or its allies or whoever, or everywhere else. The Washington Declaration created one nuclear consultative group to negotiate. It's not negotiation process or anything, but it was mostly like an information sharing system, not decision-making system, because the sole decision to whether or not to use nuclear weapons still rests with the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. So your response along the line.
Yeah. Well, in the Washington Declaration, I fully agree with you. I'm not against consultative groups, but it doesn't change anything. And the point is U.S. resolve, right? Or whoever's resolved to use nuclear weapons. So consultation is, and the nuclear sharing arrangements in NATO were, a lot of it is kind of, smoke and mirrors, right? Traditionally, it's American weapons at the end of the day. Now there are different mechanisms over there. Certainly during the Cold War, there was more integration, but in NATO, some of the Europeans are at least capable of delivering nuclear weapons, but they have to be released by the Americans. So, but it's trying to kind of present the picture, but the reality is that if a war breaks out just on the peninsula, and then the North Koreans use nuclear weapons or threaten to use nuclear weapons, and the United States then says, okay, well now it's our turn, and then North Korea says, well, we have the ability to destroy 5 American cities. or more to the point, like we think that actually might be the case. That's a really, I don't think that's a solvable situation. And sending like SSBN port visits are completely meaningless. I don't know. I mean, the SSBNs are out there. The whole point is that you never see them. Going to a port is meaningless, completely meaningless. Honestly, almost kind of like, it's almost like nobody knows what they're talking about. Like that, it's so brazen that it has no meaning. I don't know what the ultimate answer is. I mean, the best answer would be if we could deny, including through negotiation potentially, North Korea's ICBM delivery capability, because so long as the U.S. is invulnerable to North Korea, then there's really no reason we shouldn't use nuclear weapons. By the way, I think it's actually more difficult to say that we would end the North Korean regime than that we would use nuclear weapons. I mean, I think you could imagine the United States using nuclear weapons in a kind of controlled way. But of course, if we seek to end the North Korean regime, of course, the North Koreans are going to use all their nuclear weapons. We have to assume. I mean, of course, but we have to assume that. So I think that's actually more dramatic to say that. But that's already baked in. So what do we do? Whatever we do, we should do together in consultation. But I think we need to be much more open-minded to other alternatives, than more dramatic alternatives than the current situation is. I just don't think that's a serious answer. And then your point on Japan, and I mean, Japan is critical. I mean, Japan is the most important, in a sense, most important ally of the United States, I'd say, in the world. Whether that's not a comment on Japan's being superior or inferior, it's just a fact of like the size of the Japanese economy and its position. I mean, I think the Japanese are making progress, but it's very slow and it's from a low base. I mean, South Korea spends 2.5% of GDP on defense. It has a very sophisticated and large military that's trained and everything. It's ready. Japan's nowhere near there. I mean, they're going to get to 2% by 2027, if we're lucky. So, and I generally, I mean, I saw that NATO is going to open an office in Tokyo, and I'm just thinking to myself, NATO can't even take care of itself in Europe without extensive U.S. help, which should not be available because the U.S. should be focusing on Asia and cannot do both fully. NATO should focus on NATO, and Japan and South Korea and Australia and Taiwan, the Philippines should focus on Asia because that's the main theater. That's my view.
Thank you. Tong Kim, would you have a follow-up?
Yes. I was wondering whether you think there might be some room for diplomacy to play in this situation at all, other than just the strategic calculations and balances and counterbalances and threats and counter threats. Of course, the Biden administration tried, but not very hard. And I don't think it's only, although both South Korea and Washington say, we are open to negotiation with the North Korea once they are genuinely interested in talking to denuclearization. But I don't think a denuclearization it should be the final step and the goal, not from the beginning. Once in other words, I don't think you can just demand for negotiation, demanding denuclearization first. So what is your thought on this? Well,
I think the baseline has to be strategic and defense. We have to operate from a position of strength. So both, most importantly, vis-a-vis China, but also vis-a-vis North Korea. I mean, I think diplomacy has a role. I mean, the administration has basically been pleading with China to allow a call between President Biden and Xi Jinping, and the Chinese have refused. So I think we're in a pretty dire, tense time. And obviously the Chinese are deepening their relations with the Russians. And I think they're in a pretty good position right now, Beijing, I would say. I don't think America's in a very good position, despite a lot of the rhetoric. I have to be very skeptical about the prospects for diplomacy with North Korea. I mean, I like you, I would be flexible on the denuclearization issue, because obviously we're not, at this point, we can't expect to persuade North Korea to denuclearize. I mean, I think that's a fool's errand. But even when President Trump seemed to be willing to kind of put that sort of thing on the table, it didn't lead anywhere. So I you know, I think we should be open to it, but I don't think we can rely on it.
Thank you. Don Kirk.
Thank you.
Go
I'm
ahead.
here. I'm here.
All right, go ahead.
Well, in the first place, I haven't read your book, and I obviously I should, and hopefully I will. But we seem to be forming a defensive line, actually. Although you don't think we're sufficiently doing enough, clearly, from Northeast Asia, Korea, and Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, down to Australia with AUKUS, and then we hear about the Quad 4, although I can hardly believe India is going to be an enthusiastic participant in that. But I wonder, and you may have talked about this in your remarks, I came in a few minutes late, but I wonder what you think of this defensive line that we're forming, and how effective it will be, and where it's going in terms of the confrontation in between, obviously, between China and the U.S. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think you might find my book of interest because it's pretty much about that, and why.
Great.
The defensive line along the first island chain, which has been our defensive position since the end of the Second World War. But I think we're kind of refocusing on it. That was certainly something we were trying to do in the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and of course, including South Korea in that perimeter. But it's all about, at this point, I think the strategy is pretty much settled, agreed, which is denial. I mean, the administration has talked about denial as the standard, defense standard. So that's great. That's what I've been arguing for. The question is, can we fulfill it, and can our allies fulfill it? And South Korea is a noble exception. I mean, Taiwan is really lagging. I mean, really, really not pulling its weight, and it's in dire danger. And Japan is way behind. I mean, it's improving, but it's coming from way behind. So, in that kind of situation, weakness can be provocative or induce or tempt an aggressor to move. And I fear that's where, pardon me, where we might be, in the sense that that China's clearly preparing for conflict. I mean, I think indisputably, and not only preparing for conflict locally, but building a military and a basing architecture to go way beyond the first island chain. I mean, once they break out of the first island chain. Otherwise, why are they building nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers and Marine Corps and space architecture and overseas bases? I mean, it's just whatever they say. And actually, they admit it now. They used to say they would never do that. Now they've blown through that. So basically, we can expect them to be like the United States, which is pretty scary. So got to hold them at the first island chain, because if they can't get out of the first island chain, their military projection is very limited, because they're boxed in on the landward approaches. I mean, or there's just very difficult to project power, obviously, across the Himalayas, across Russia. If they break out of the first island chain, we're in a lot of trouble. I mean, it's equivalent to the British problem with the Germans in the wars.
Well,
Your follow-up question, Don.
yeah, your response gives rise to a bunch of questions. Taiwan only has 23 million people. For an island quasi nation of 23 million, do you really think are you sure they're all that weak? And don't you think, and are you sure that Japan isn't that well developed militarily? They don't have a large military force numerically, but they have an awful lot of sophistication and skill as far as their ability to, as far as what they have, they could ability to use what they have. And Japan might get involved in a war for Taiwan. In fact, I think would.
That would be crucial.
So Is there any chance that you're underestimating the defense of Taiwan? I was surprised that you think it's that weak. Thank you.
I mean, look, I'm not Sergeant York, but what I read is, and what I hear from people who know better, it's very down about Taiwan, for a variety of reasons, and the Taiwan military. Really pretty depressing. I could be wrong. I fear I'm not, and I definitely think we should plan on the downside so that we're, better to be over prepared than under prepared. In the case of Japan, obviously they have, elements of excellence in their military. Their submarine force, from what I understand, elements of their air forces are quite good. But, it's not a military that's been trained to fight anywhere outside of the home islands, right, for direct defense of Japanese territory, according to the traditional deal with the Americans defending beyond. So, yes, in a larger conflict where there's, water space management and so forth with ASW and aircraft and bases, but that really hasn't happened yet. There's the beginnings of that. There Marines are training with the JGSDF, and there are Japanese forces deploying to the Southwest Islands with anti-ship missiles. That's good. I'm and this is not, I mean, this is also true of our forces, which are very, very good, but are not trained for and set up at this point for high-end conflict against a pure adversary. So for instance, the Air Force has, to its credit, developed this concept of agile combat employment, which is basically bouncing around to different locations to deal with the long-range Chinese missile threat. But as far as I can tell, it's still largely, I don't want to say it's a paper exercise, but it's far from being like a realized concept. So that's all bad. The good thing is that the Chinese also have not appeared to perfect joint power projection, amphibious landing operations, carrier operations, these kinds of things that would allow them to project power effectively. So it's more that the inherent difficulty of the geography and the fact that the PLA, appears, in its own open writing. I mean, this is, go to hear what the RAND people who study the Chinese military have to say. They say the Chinese are still wondering, but I don't like those odds. And I think the Chinese are improving. Admiral Thomas, the 7th Fleet Commander, I think he said last year that the Chinese had improved markedly in joint operations over the last couple of years. Said that in the Wall Street Journal. And I think there's, what you hear is that the Taiwanese military exercise, unlike, say, ROC military exercises, are largely scripted. Pretty much people go in for 4 months. And again, I'm not like, don't get me wrong, I'm not Sergeant Slaughter, but I'm just saying when we're looking at this empirically. So that makes me worried. And I think, the PLA is, Xi Jinping seems pretty serious. So again, I don't know, but I don't think it's prudent for us to bet on the upside.
Thank you. David Lee.
Hi, yes, thank
Go
you so
ahead.
much for your comments and insight. Recently, British American Tobacco was fined for dealing with North Korea and violating sanctions. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts and your opinions on how, the strategy of sanctions and things like that might change or take into account the work of, private entities, many of which, for example, British American Tobacco makes around upwards of $30 billion a year. And so they might consider that these sanctions, fines from these sanctions might end up being, ultimately operational costs. I'm just wondering how we might take into account all of that.
I think we spend way too much time talking about sanctions, honestly, because I don't think they're very effective when we look at the record, and they're not being very effective against Russia. For a lot of reasons, but if we're thinking about, are they going to be effective? I mean, they have not been effective against North Korea, manifestly. I mean, like totally ineffective as far as I can tell, right? I mean, they have not, obviously they have imposed costs on the North Korean government or North Korean people, and they've degraded, presumably, and retarded the development of their missile and nuclear programs, but they haven't fundamentally changed the calculus at all. hasn't worked in Cuba, didn't work against Saddam Hussein, hasn't really worked against Iran. Maybe Iran, there's a stronger case, probably a relatively stronger case. But Russia right now is continuing the wars full bore, backed by China. So I think in that context, I think we should just, I don't think sanctions would, I think the Chinese are going to be worried about the economic impact of starting a war. Yes, for sure. They are going to factor that in. That's going to be a significant cost and risk. Although if they're very successful quickly, they might gain economically, right? Because countries might say, I'm gonna toss in my lot with China. So people shouldn't underestimate the extent to which a war might be beneficial for China. But I think once a war has started, economic sanctions are very unlikely to have a significant effect, other than as basically kind of like degrading Chinese or North Korean, military capabilities on the margin.
Very good. Larry Nix.
Thank you, Sangju. Can you hear me?
All right, very good. Go ahead.
Yes. Mr. Colby, a lot of the discussion, especially regarding North Korea and China and Taiwan, have revolved around the issue of deterrence, although the word hasn't been used much in our session so far. But I'd like to shift the focus towards diplomatic political deterrence on the issue of Taiwan, because it seems to me the United States ought to be considering at this point, especially if Chinese provocations continue to escalate, issuing a statement directly to the Chinese to the one China policy and will continue to adhere to the one China policy on the condition that China maintains a policy of peace towards Taiwan. But if China resorts to military force against Taiwan, the United States would be prepared to support any measure adopted by the Taiwan government through democratic processes to change Taiwan's legal status, legal relationship with China. Actually, you could actually add to that last clause, including a declaration of independence. Now, it seems to me that would, to the Chinese, escalate in their minds the potential cost of failure if they should resort to military force against Taiwan. And if I'm correct that this could be, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, an effective measure of diplomatic political deterrence, would it also be strengthened, therefore, if the US administration, in this case Biden, made this statement public, as well as giving it first to the Chinese government?
Well, what I would say is I don't think that, excuse me for once, it's a little hot in here. I don't think what is going to be the critical variable for China in terms of its decision is U.S. position on the political status of Taiwan, although that is material. But I think to me, the fundamental factor is the military balance, because if the U.S. says we would recognize an independent Taiwan, but China just runs over Taiwan and ingests it, what we say is not going to matter, right? It's like the position of the Baltic states during the Cold War or something. It's not really going to have an effect. So that's the critical predicate is effective deterrence, persuading the Chinese that they would fail ideally. if they, which is, what Mao Zedong concluded. Presumably Mao Zedong would have had no compunction in starting a war to get after Chiang Kai-shek, but he realized that he would have failed. That's why I didn't do it. Rightly. So I think the problem here with that idea, I imagine, while I have, I see its logic, is that we are now in a situation where the outcome of a conflict is sort of uncertain, basically. And the question is where to put our sort of our effort in strengthening deterrence, but also being conscious that China may decide to start a war, may decide to attack. I actually think that, so this leads me, my view is different, that my view is we should invest, and I think this is the view of at least some in the administration, that we should invest our kind of capital in strengthening the military deterrent for Taiwan and make a lot less noise politically. I think we're actually making too much noise politically about Taiwan. And actually, we may actually be pushing China, inadvertently pushing China to be more likely to act because it thinks the Taiwan issue is getting out of is becoming unsolvable from Beijing's point of view. While we're not doing enough to strengthen the military deterrent. If we were so strong that we could just swat away a Chinese invasion, then we could insult Beijing all that we wanted on the Taiwan issue. But I don't think it's very advisable, and I'm not suggesting that you're saying we insult China, but there is this trend in American kind of politics in particular, where there's visits to Taiwan and various things with Taiwanese officials is very, rightly or not, justly or not, it's very it registers with Beijing. And at the same time, I don't think we're really doing as much, and the Taiwanese are not doing as much as we need on the defense side. So I think your point, Mr. Nix, is a valid one. I would leave it somewhat implicit, probably, in the sense that, I think I've said this to Chinese before, which is, the United States had determined to abandon Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of the ROC, at the end of the Civil War, and Mao Zedong was preparing to invade Formosa, right, to invade Taiwan, and it was only the outbreak of war on the Korean Peninsula that led Truman to, say, put the Seventh Fleet in the Strait. I believe it was the outbreak of war, not the Chinese intervention. I'm not exactly sure, but anyway, the point being that, like, if you start something, and obviously Kim Il-sung was not going to act without Mao Zedong's permission and Joseph Stalin's permission. If you start something, everything is going to be on the table, and things will happen that you're not going to like. We're going to make sure you're not going to be happy at whatever happens. So that's sort of how I'd put it.
Larry, do you have a follow-up question?
Well, actually several, but I'll maintain it restricted to one. In terms of what China may decide in terms of using military force against Taiwan, how important do you think, in Chinese calculations, the upcoming elections in Taiwan will be next year? Whether the Democratic Progressive Party, the current ruling party, retains power, or whether the Kuomintang, the old Chinese Nationalist Party, which has been more, amenable towards China in recent years, wins that election. In terms of what China may calculate, how important do you think the outcome of this election will be in terms of the decisions that China will make afterwards?
There is a lot of focus on the 24 Taiwanese election in terms of Beijing's calculations, and others know Chinese leadership decision-making far better than I do. My tendency is to see that as less important than kind of more structural factors, in the sense that, I think the military balance around Taiwan, over Taiwan, the general perception of a deepening confrontation with the United States that Xi Jinping seems to believe and has some justification structurally, and the recognition that people on Taiwan are almost certainly never going to voluntarily become part of the People's Republic, at least in the foreseeable future. That series of factors leads me to think that military action is highly plausible because it makes sense from Beijing's point of view. They are not going to resolve this issue or make progress on this issue without military force, in my view. And I assume that they're as smart, if not smarter than I am. It's a low bar, but that leads me to think they would look for an opportunity. But then they would. I mean, obviously there are huge downsides and risks, so they're not going to be sort of blithe about it. But there is going to be a tendency to be open to action or kind of a militarily very significant crisis designed to kind of resolve like a war. In that case, I don't think like a particular election, like if I were Beijing, I wouldn't allow myself to be driven by a particular political event. Now, they might use it as a pretext, but there's a tendency among China watchers to say that China will only attack if they're sort of provoked so much that that they'll just do it out of like desperation. I don't really see it that way because I see them as like they want this. They're gonna, they're like a lion, I don't know, like a dragon, if you will, right? And they're gonna strike when it's most in their advantage. And that I don't think that has much to do with the 24 election, but that's my own view.
Thank you. Ben,
Yes, can you
okay,
hear me?
go ahead.
Thank you so much, Bridge, for the terrific, insightful remarks. So the question is, I know this is a little bit outside your lane, but is there more that you think the United States should be doing on the semiconductor issue? Semiconductors, advanced chips, of course, go into some of the most advanced weapons in China. As you know, the U.S. and its key allies and partners control about 92% of the highest global market share when it comes to chips. And so far, it seems that we're trying to bring a lot more onshore here and also restrict China's chips. I was wondering if you had thoughts about what else the United States could be doing on the chips question.
Well, thanks, Daniel, and thanks for your kind introduction. I think we're doing pretty well on the semiconductors front. I think the administration actually seems to be doing pretty well on the economic sort of competition with China front. My main critique is they're relying too much on it because I don't think it's going to be dispositive. I don't think China's going to be fundamentally coerced or deterred by economic sanctions. And, if they take over Taiwan, I mean, I assume that we would try to extricate the engineers and destroy the facility as part of a collapse. If that had to happen, we would both lose that. And I could see them acting in other ways to interrupt the supply of chips. But I'm not sure there. I mean, my impression, and I'm far from an expert on this, as you indicate, but my impression, just reading a bit of people who do know a lot more about it, is that we're very unlikely to create a serious semiconductor replacement to what they have in Taiwan in the near term. I could be too bearish, but I'm skeptical. So I think honestly, I think we're doing okay on the economic and semiconductor front, but we actually should be focusing. Not that we should be doing less, but it should be less of it should be a secondary part of our overall strategy. We should be focused on military denial because that's what's really going to matter. I mean, if the Chinese what would we even do? I mean, we're basically in a situation of mutual assured destruction economically, because if they attack Taiwan, well, then it would interrupt semiconductors for everybody, right? Including us. And if we sanction their food and energy imports, well, they have, my colleague and friend Chris Vassallo was tweeting about this. They're working on diversifying their sources and producing more coal indigenously, but also they have ways of tanking our economy. So in that circumstance, getting back to Sean's point, I don't think we have an advantage because they're probably more resolute over the issue, and they probably, with an authoritarian government, they have more ability to get their people to just grin and bear it. So my general view, and this is where I think the administration was probably, it was actually, I didn't go through all the specifics of the summit declaration, but is putting more of an emphasis on the relationship with Iraq, on the economic dimensions of the sort of competition with China, whereas I would probably focus more on making sure Iraq is able to assume as much of its own defense as possible, is prepared for supporting us in a Taiwan scenario. And if Iraq wants to trade with China, we're all trading with China. I mean, U.S. trade, Jake Sullivan pointed out, U.S. trade is at an all-time high. So but they're going to be trading with us too. I mean, we should be reducing our exposure in things like, pharmaceuticals and that kind of thing, semiconductors. But I don't think, I think we should be more laser focused on that military denial along the first island chain. And the Korean Peninsula. That's the key issue.
Thank you. Robert Albert, go ahead. Robert.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Go ahead.
Appreciate it. Yes, Mr. Colby. Hey, read your book, love it. I just got I just want to add a perspective here. If I was China, you're looking at the United States with failed wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and most recently with the situation in Sudan. General Berger, the commandant of the Marine Corps, came out and said, "Hey, I don't have a ship to even do a MEU, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, to do a NEO, so to evacuate these people." And then this will be the second year the United States military is prospected to miss its recruiting goals.
Right.
So I don't think we're in as great shape as everyone says when, out of one side of the commandant's mouth, I'm going to be able to do expeditionary advanced space operations in the Pacific. But then, just recently, wow, can't even pull Americans out of Sudan because there's not enough ships. So, you said we would have a good Navy in 2024, and just sort of want to throw that out. Yeah. I mean, how do you think the Chinese read all this that I just discussed with you?
I'm in your camp, Robert, and thanks for your kind words in the book. I mean, if you follow me on Twitter or anything, you'll see I'm always just kind of hammering on limits of our military capability. There's the Navy, the GAO report just in the last couple of days, the GAO report on the pitiful readiness levels in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't just the NEO in Sudan. I believe the 31st
the 31st MEU out of Okinawa. Yes.
They did not have a ship to do their operations. That is the tip of the spear.
Yes.
That is force design poster child. So like that, wow, really, like, geez, that's not good, right? And that's the force that has the best chance of being ready by like 2030.
Yes.
At the same time, everybody wants to build more submarines and give them to the Australians, but we're only building 1.2 attack submarines a year. That's what the industrial base can support. And then it's reported that we can only build 2 destroyers a year too, even though the Congress has said build 3. So, in the recruiting goals, there's pilot shortages in the Air Force. I mean, so like sometimes people are saying, "Oh, you're being too negative. Especially military people, like the enemy's going to see that." My view is, especially in democracy, the only way you're going to get corrective action is for people to understand the severity and the scale of the threat, and then they'll act accordingly. What's going on now, in my experience in Washington, the kind of official circles, with a few exceptions, is a sort of generalized acceptance that China is a challenge and that it's very important, but it's very diffuse and superficial in my view relative to the scale of the actual challenge, which is that China is a pure economy with all that entails, and I don't think people have really accepted that, and that it's preparing its military for war. It's, as Aquilino says, unprecedented peacetime military buildup. They're doing nuclear breakout, and seems like people don't really care. I mean, I don't know. It's just some commentary on it, but during the
Yeah.
Cold War, this was like the issue in the presidential election. Like this was everybody's hiding under their desks. So, I go back to the beginning. I'm very worried because, and now, I mean, my view is we're making the situation worse in Ukraine.
Mhm.
And I've said this to the Japanese and the Australians and the Taiwanese, and I think it's to some extent true with South Korea, although South Korea seems to have been less caught up in this. But there's a lot of this sort of Three Musketeers, rules-based international order stuff, and that's just not prudent. I mean, we are depleting air defense stocks, other kinds of stocks, Stingers, Javelins that would be useful in a Taiwan fight. And by the way, a war with China would likely be attritional and protracted if we were lucky, if we weren't just outright defeated, and it could involve a conflict on the peninsula. Are we prepared for that? No. People are acting like the defense industrial base has been fixed, but actually it's been getting worse. I mean,
Worse,
things
yes.
are happening like multi-year procurement contracts, but if you listen to what the CEO of Lockheed Martin or whatever, Dave Norquist, the former deputy secretary, things are actually getting worse. Like there's huge thing, and we can't fix those obviously like from one day to the next, but we could have a national mobilization, and we could act like, well, if we're in a hole, stop digging. And that's not what we're doing. We're saying we can walk and chew gum. And we're basically moving towards a situation where we're just hoping the Chinese don't do something. I think that's where we're heading. And that they think, when you see administration officials like Undersecretary Call, who's a very intelligent person, very smart guy, but he's heavily emphasizing the lack of Chinese, readiness and capability for top tier operations. And that really worries me because I'm like, that's what we got. Like when was the U.S. Navy last in a fleet action? 1945.
Exactly. Yes.
When did the U.S. Air Force go toe to toe with the peer, air threat? I mean,
Korean War.
yeah, really, really.
Yeah.
Korea. Maybe MiGs over North Vietnam.
Yes.
But yeah, basically, right? Not Iraq.
No.
And when you look at the numbers and the positioning and the vulnerability of bases, even if you do give them, let's say 50% discount on our forces, they still might win because of all those other dimensions. And so that's kind of, I mean, that's just where I'm seeing things. And
Yes. Yeah. And if I may ask a follow-up, sir?
Yeah.
And just on the, getting back to, General Berger and the ship shortage, wouldn't this be a perfect time to say to our partners in Asia, give us and pilot a ship for us for this exercise? Like, it's weird. We're talking about partnerships and
I know
partner capabilities, but we're not exercising them when we need them.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't get why that's like, when you see, that's why I say like national mobilization. I really should say like national and allied mobilization. But there was a telling, okay, so you can tell when a country is like really put on the alarm, the siren, and saying like we're serious about something, right?
Yeah.
That's not where we are. There was an article about how we're very constrained, unlike South Korea, in the production of 155mm shells. And one of the reasons why is because the one plant that does it in Pennsylvania is subject to the National Register of Historic Places, which, like, I love history. I love to visit historic places in America. But like, if what's stopping expansion of the facility is a regulation about historical preservation, then we're obviously not in a situation of national mobilization, right? Like that's, and another one would be like, well, look, in principle, Buy American's great, but we don't have the shipbuilding capacity, partially because South Korea kind of deliberately created it. But okay, here we are where we are. Why don't we buy a bunch of South Korean ships and just make it work? Why don't we buy a bunch of Japanese missiles and just give them the technology, figure out how to do it? Oh no, we got to go through this process. It's got to go through congressional authorization, right? Which is telling you that we're not. Look at the difficulty Australia is having with AUKUS. Yes, on the submarines, although that's going relatively well, quote unquote. But I mean more on like the the co-production and technology transfer, they're having a heck of a time.
Mhm.
And that's Australia. That's like Australia and UK are basically closest allies. And like if the Australians are having that trouble, that's worrying. My view is like we'll figure it out later. You know, like, is there an environmental regulation? Off. Is there a historical regulation? Off. Are there these labor regulations? Done. You know, pay them what you have to, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like, okay, that's how you get something done. Oh, do the South Koreans have something? We'll figure out how to use it. You know, I mean, we took ships off the bottom of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Like, I'm sure we can figure this stuff out.
Yes. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Sean Kramer, go ahead.
All right,
Sean.
sir. Thank you. Yes, sir, Mr. Colby. I dropped in two comments in the text box at the bottom, but circling back on your comment regarding the Washington Declaration, papering over the problem, what might be the next step to improve upon it, particularly since we're asking the Koreans to kind of expand their the horizon of the Mutual Defense Treaty to include China, instead of being completely focused on North Korea.
I mean, it's hard for me to say, but I would just open up the conversation to, I mean, everything that is necessary for an effective defense of South Korea and a credible defense that's consistent with American interests and resolve should be on the table. I mean, whether that's deployment of nuclear weapons forward, that's like a starting point. You know what I mean? I mean, that just seems like a pretty low bar. So I just, you know, but let's actually solve this problem in a way that's realistic.
Yes,
That's my take.
yes, sir. And I also heard you make a comment about how, again, Korea should focus on providing the bulk of its conventional defense, and there may be some limited U.S. or some degraded U.S. Capability to participate in the collective defense of Korea in, say, a Taiwan scenario. I know I may disagree with that a little bit. I know while Taiwan is strategically important, I would offer that that our alliance and prioritizing threats that the defense of Korea and or Japan might be more important than, say, the defense of Taiwan.
Oh, no, I agree with you. Yeah, I don't think we should try to reorient the ROC towards. Sorry if I gave that impression. That's not what I mean. I think the ROC should be focused on self-defense. I talk about this in my book. I mean, that you're gonna have your hands full. I mean,
Yes.
more in the event of a Taiwan scenario, and there isn't anything that's happened yet on the peninsula. You know, obviously, the ROC, in my view, should support us, but maintaining its focus on self-defense of South Korea and by extension Japan. That should definitely be the focus of, like, you don't need a Navy or long-range Air Force that can go. That's you got your hands full. I agree.
And I would offer it's probably a little bit more of Northeast Asia, particularly Korea and Japan, has been a position of strength. And we probably should reinforce that first before we perhaps challenge, reinforce that first before we try and, increase our involvement in, say, the defense of Taiwan, rather than trying to.
I'm sympathetic to that, except the defense of Taiwan is really important to the defense of Japan, right? I mean, if the Chinese break out of the first island chain and are able to put pressure directly on Japan, ultimately Korea can be effectively encircled.
Yes, sir.
So we may get to that point, God forbid, but I think it would be a disaster for us all if Taiwan were to fall. But obviously, South Korea is more important, frankly, than candidly than Taiwan. But Taiwan is really important.
Yes, sir.
So.
Thank you. Sungjae, are you there?
Yes, thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Well, yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for your explanation. And, well, actually, we respect one China, but nobody told Taiwan is a land of communist China. And also, what I understand is what the China using the same word with us, but different definition. So that's why China make got confused to us.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it's, if our neighboring, someone who has some wolf with their hand, and then saying to us, well, don't worry, I'm holding wolf, so it's not gonna hurt you. But best way for us to make things safe will be the having a fence. So you are the strategy person. So maybe what will be our kind of fence defense from the China?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think a military defense, it's sort of simple, but I think it's the safest bet. And a really strong perimeter along the first island chain, and obviously the South Korean border with the north. That is our best. That is our best bet. And of course, it plays to the natural American strength in the aerospace and maritime domains. More obviously, South Korea connects to North Korea, as we all know, but is the exception. But I think that's the best fence. Good fences make good neighbors, we say in America. I'm sure there's an expression like that in Korea. But my hope is actually we can get to a position of détente with China, but it has to be from a position of strength. It has to be where China is compelled to respect our interests and then decides that it's better to negotiate respectfully. Right now, I think they're clearly, I mean, Xi Jinping and his, Qinggong and all these, I mean, they are clearly not in that mindset because they think the world is going their way and they can dominate. And they will treat all of the other countries of Asia, especially as second or third, tributaries. And Korea is very familiar with that from its history, of course. But I think, look at the way they've treated the Philippines, in the recent years in Australia, et cetera. So I think, yes, we need a good, strong fence, again, with the emphasis on denial and defense, so that we should not provoke a war that does not need to happen, because it would be horrible, truly. But we also must be strong, But this is what we did in the Cold War on the whole. I mean, not as successfully in Asia as in Europe. Now Asia is more important than Europe, but it would be, if we could replicate, people say, oh, it's so terrible to have another Cold War. And I think to myself, well, it could be a lot worse. It could be World War II, it could be the victory of fascism and communism. That's an alternative history. So if we could be as successful as the Cold War in Europe, then we would be very lucky.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, Don Kirk, go ahead.
Well, yes, getting back to Korea, you seem to think that we could rely on Korea when it comes to Taiwan. I don't think we can rely on Korea when it comes to anything to do with China, because Korea, by the way, I don't think Korea was even, I don't think China that was, or Taiwan, I mean, was mentioned in the anywhere in the joint declaration or in anything to do with the recent summit. I wonder why you think Korea would help us in Taiwan when every indication is that they don't even want our planes taking off for anything to do with Taiwan. And for that matter, it seems to me that Korea's relationship with Japan is not all that, is far from certain. The Japanese prime minister is going to Seoul, I think on Sunday, actually, for a summit with President Yoon. But, do you really think that Korea and Japan in an actual showdown with China are going to be able to cooperate that closely? And finally, as far as Korea is concerned, their armed forces are down to about 450,000 men, as opposed to 1.2 million North Koreans under arms. Granted, they have pretty good hardware, although we're not sure how really great it is, but they do have probably better hardware than most other countries in Asia, except for Japan, which I think you may underestimate. what do you think of this relationship with Japan? Are they really going to be able to work together? And would Korea really support us in Taiwan, which I can tell you, I don't think they would, but what do you think?
Well, I'm skeptical about South Korean-Japanese relations for all the reasons that everybody's familiar with. And I personally sometimes think we put too much effort into rapprochement since I'm not sure how necessary it is, but I mean, some level of collaboration is good, but it's really pushing a rock up a hill. I get your point about a Taiwan scenario. I mean, look, if the United States is in a war with China over Taiwan, that is not just a war over Taiwan. That is a war for whether the United States and its alliance system survives, essentially, in the Western Pacific. So I think South Korea will see its interests as being, it's not Vietnam, right? I mean, as terrible as Vietnam was, it was a limited, very localized war in Indochina. We were fighting against the Vietnamese communists. We were not fighting against the Soviet Union. It was, but a war over Taiwan would be against our primary opponent. And if the Chinese were victorious, South Korea essentially would probably be at their, if they defeated the American military in the Western Pacific, who would protect South Korea from the Chinese? I mean, we couldn't. I mean, you have a war over Taiwan. U.S. is throwing in its B-2s, B-21s, attack submarines, all of our crown jewels, our space assets, our aircraft, I mean, to the extent they're relevant, our aircraft carriers, our cruisers, our destroyers, our marine, the 31st MEU, our advanced marine units, our best, air defense assets. If we lose that war, the rock is, forget a fence. If you think 1.2 million North Koreans are going to be a problem for the South Koreans, imagine them backed by the PLA, which is not the PLA of 1950 anymore. So, I mean, you may be right about the rock. Part of the point I wanted to come tonight, and also I'm trying to do a bit more in South Korea, is because I think it's really important that South Korea see the stakes. I mean, I think there is a tendency in the United States, I don't know in South Korea too, but in the United States, say, I mean, I'm kind of in the back of my mind, we could lose Taiwan, and we would redraw the perimeter, and like we'll go on, and it's like it's going to be really desperate at that point, because all of those munitions are going to be out, and it's going to be very difficult to resuscitate them. And by the way, I would expect Chinese non-kinetic and like cyber and possibly kinetic attacks on our industrial base, which is going to mean that it's going to take years to reconstitute a fighting force that could take on the Chinese, if possible at all. So from my point of view, I mean, if I'm thinking about it from South Korea's point of view, that's a pretty grim, I mean, and then maybe South Korea cuts a deal with Beijing, but then, forget any autonomy. I mean, obviously China's not going to let South Korea make its own decisions, right? At that point, it's going to be part of the Chinese orbit. So that's the way I look at it.
Very good. Thank you. Ken Moriyasu, go ahead.
Hi, Bridge.
Okay.
Hi. I found it interesting that you said the SSBN visit to South Korea is meaningless, but I have a feeling that if that happens in the middle of May, there will be a big discussion in Japan about why is it going to Korea but not Japan. And Japan, of course, has the 3 non-nuclear principles, which is not having nuclear weapons, not producing nuclear weapons, and the third one, critically, not allowing anybody to bring in nuclear weapons. And I have a feeling that there will be discussions of maybe reducing the 3 principles into 2 principles and relaxing the third one, allowing America to bring in nuclear assets to Japanese territory. As a strategist in the Pentagon, was Japan's 3 principles a problem for you in formulating strategy? And what do you think? Would such a move, which would require some political capital and like take a lot of time and energy, is it worth changing? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ken. Not really, because I don't think that so the reason that I'm saying it's meaningless, and thanks for giving me a chance to elaborate, is that a ballistic missile submarine can launch a submarine launched ballistic missile from anywhere it is in the ocean and basically hit a target in China or Russia or North Korea or whatever. So its function is to hide with pride, as they say in the submarine force, right? And so going to a forward port, actually, if anything, it makes it more vulnerable, right? Because it's within the range of Chinese, aircraft and missiles. I mean, not that that's likely, but it really adds nothing. I mean, even an aircraft would at least have some, like if you were basing nuclear weapons in South Korea or Japan, that would be a new move. But like a ballistic missile submarine is almost like calculated to be the least relevant sort of mechanism. So it's entirely totemic. And the fact that it's going to cause problems in Japan is like almost makes it even worse. And it doesn't address the issue at stake, which is the resolve of the Americans to actually pull the lanyard in the event, right? It has no logical connection to it. It's not like some new weapon that we're introducing that suddenly obviates or the North Korean ICBM threat. No. So to me, it's like totally in the realm of nuclear symbolism. And so the three no's, I mean, since the Cold War, it's not been really a problem because of American conventional military dominance. My understanding during the Cold War was sometimes it was, like, don't ask, don't tell, right? I don't know. I don't know the history, and Okinawa was separate and all that for a long time. But Japan faces very similar problems to South Korea, maybe less acutely, but similar solutions for Japan would be just as basically kind of without foundation as they would be for South Korea. Even if, like, this is why I objected to Prime Minister Abe's article about nuclear sharing, even because as long as the Americans still retain control, and the Chinese know that, and the North Koreans know that, we haven't addressed the fundamental problem. It's a formality, and I think we're way beyond formality. So I think we need to be looking. I mean, the most important thing we can try to do together is maintain the conventional denial capability, or restore it to the extent, and that's why Japan's actions are especially important, but need to be accelerated. But, as better than I do, I mean, it's coming from a relatively low base especially in terms of dealing with like an adversary like the PRC. So, but that's the most important. But these sort of symbolic things, I don't think are very useful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joe Park.
Yes, thank you
ahead.
so much.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for your insight. And in terms of North Korea's 7 nuclear tests, so last year, North Korea did unprecedented provocation by firing missile. And there was a speculation that North Korea would do 7 nuclear tests, but they didn't. And then South Korean media said it is because of China having a major political event at the time, so they delay or something. So what do you think, what kind of role China could play in this situation in terms of 7 nuclear tests of North Korea?
I don't think China's going to help us with North Korea at all at this point. I mean, I think to the contrary, everything with China is now basically, I mean, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's basically zero sum. They see things as fundamentally in rivalry with the United States. And so what they're doing with Russians in the Middle East and with North Korea is not going to. So I don't think 8 years ago, I thought we could maybe pressure them to help us on North Korea, but I think that ship has sailed. So they'll make their own decisions about whether it's useful or not to allow North Korea, to the extent they can, to permit North Korea to conduct the test. But at this point, I personally, from a planning point of view, I feel we have to assume that North Korean nuclear weapons are sufficiently effective to, work if they're used against even the United States.
Thanks.
Okay, Daniel, go ahead.
So I recognize we're over time, but I wanted to, sorry, I got a baby crying in the background. If I can yell over him, he usually wins over me. Because you mentioned your deep appreciation for history. I have to ask, if you were to reassess U.S. If you were to assess U.S. decision making and its involvement in the Korean War, where would you land? Because I could agree with you in the sense of first principles. but all the benefits of being in an alliance with South Korea, being an economic and technological powerhouse, militarily important. None of those existed, perhaps except the geographic position. So I'm just wondering if you were to assess it, what would you think?
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think the success of South Korea is one of the reasons why it was such worthwhile, right? Is that it's immensely important. And of course, the geography as well were very significant. I think the best thing you can do about a war is to deter it. And I know that this history has become more complicated, or the historiography, but I mean, Atchison really seemed to screw up in giving the green light. Maybe that's simplification, but whatever it is that we communicated to the communist bloc, to Stalin and Mao, that it would be okay, to invade the South. I mean, also, not to suggest that South Korea is derivative, but the defense of Japan becomes incredibly difficult if South Korea is under hostile control, right? I mean, obviously that was part of the Japanese reason for its tragic occupation of South Korea. Similarly true with Taiwan, but it's much more the case with South Korea. Look, obviously, if we're going back and rewinding history, the collapse of the Republic of China to the CCP was an epic disaster. And I don't know enough to say how much of that was reversible. Obviously there's a huge literature on this. But once China went vehemently communist, we were in a lot of trouble all around. I'm more skeptical of the deep intervention in Indochina, especially after, just kind of once it became clear that was a war of attrition. And I mean, it's just the geography of Indochina makes it so much easier for both the insurgency and communist regular forces to attack the U.S. and its ally in South Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. So I think it holds up. I think the thing would have been to deter, and that's where I'm sort of an Eisenhower type in the sense that my strategy for today is more flexible response, which he opposed, but that's a conclusion based on the evolution of the power relationships and the military balance. It's not. I think Eisenhower was right to try to scare the communists more effectively into not attacking us, and also being careful about the use of American force, obviously in 1954 in Indochina, but also ending the war on the peninsula. So that's sort of the mindset I think we need to get back to, just kind of in principle. But yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question.
Tong Kim, do you have a question? Follow up.
Well, I think earlier I asked you a question whether you think it'd be China, more trouble coming from China or North Korea, and which will happen first. You have any response to that?
Well, I think if I were China, I would have North Korea start it so I could try to distract the Americans if possible. That's what I would do, but I don't know if that's going to happen. That's going to be contextual.
Good answer.
Okay, Don Kirk.
Well, yes. China's getting a whole lot of money from the United States with this amazingly favorable trade balance. Do you think we should do something about that? We're the ones who are enriching China. For that matter, China has an incredible trade surplus with a whole lot of other countries. So, what do you think about that? Should we recognize the fact that it's because of all this money that they're earning from the United States that they're rising as a great power confronting the United States?
Well, I think they've passed that point. I mean, obviously they export to our market, but and take from us still, but I think they've gotten independent liftoff at this point. So I think they're, I think we can do things economically, but they can also do things economically to us. So, if you look at the number of like goods that they produce versus what we do, it's really striking. So, yeah, I'm a little more skeptical, but I think I know Daniel was kind enough to mention I have some kids here myself that I need to help put to bed. I know we was really delighted to go have this discussion and also to go over time, but I hope I can continue the conversation with ICAS and Sangju Yu and others, because I am looking to do more in and with Korea. I do a lot with Japan and Taiwan and Australia and excuse me, Europeans, but Korea is such an important relationship for us, and I say that sincerely and genuinely. So I'd welcome the opportunity to engage more with all of you.
Thank you, Bridge. Let me make this one comment. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principals. There's no foreign funds involved in the ICAS activities. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The proceeding is over. Bridge, we'll get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you, Bridge.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good evening, good day if you're in
Same to
Asia.
you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.